I walked into the conference room that Tuesday morning expecting our usual weekly project review. Instead, I found my father Robert sitting at the head of the mahogany table with a stack of legal documents spread before him, his reading glasses perched on his nose. Jessica sat to his right, her MBA confidence radiating from every perfectly pressed line of her navy blazer. 25 years of building Chen Associates Construction had taught my father to make quick decisions, but the way he avoided my eyes told me this wasn't about construction timelines or permit approvals. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Alex, take a seat, he said, his voice carrying that formal tone he used during board meetings. The morning light streaming through the floor-to-ceiling windows cast long shadows across the polished surface, and I noticed Jessica had positioned herself so the light fell favorably across her face while leaving me partially in shadow. Even in family meetings, she understood the importance of presentation. I've made a decision about the company's future, Robert continued, sliding a folder across the table toward me. Jessica will be taking over as head of legal affairs, effective immediately. She'll be overseeing all contracts, compliance issues, and legal strategy moving forward. The words hit me like a punch to the chest, but I kept my expression neutral. For 8 years, I had been the one handling client relations, managing our most complex projects, building relationships with contractors and city officials. I knew every permit process in Portland, every zoning regulation, every inspector's preferences. Jessica had been back from business school for exactly 6 months. "Congratulations, Jess," I managed, though my voice sounded hollow in the spacious room. She smiled that practice smile she'd perfected during her MBA presentations, the one that said she was grateful but not surprised. "Thank you, Alex. I know this is a big change, but I think my legal background and fresh perspective will really help modernize our operations," she said, her fingers already drumming against a leather portfolio I'd never seen before. "There are some compliance issues I've identified that need immediate attention." The way she said compliance issues made my stomach clench. I had been meticulous about every aspect of our operations, from building codes to worker safety regulations. Our company had never received a single violation in the 8 years I'd been managing projects. I looked at my father, searching for some explanation, some reassurance that this wasn't what it seemed. "Dad, I don't understand. What compliance issues? We just passed our annual audit with flying colors. The Morrison Street project is ahead of schedule and under budget. The residential development in Beaverton has 0 violations. What exactly is Jessica referring to?" Robert shifted in his chair, a gesture I recognized from childhood when he was uncomfortable but trying to maintain authority. "Alex, you've done good work, but the construction industry is changing. We need someone with formal legal training to navigate the increasingly complex regulatory environment. Jessica has the qualifications we need moving forward." The word qualifications stung. I had been working in this industry since I was 16, starting with summer jobs on construction sites, learning every aspect of the business from the ground up. I knew the weight of rebar, the proper mixing ratios for concrete in Portland's climate, the personalities of every building inspector in the city. Jessica knew legal theory and case studies from textbooks. Besides, Jessica added, opening her portfolio with theatrical precision, there are some irregularities in recent project documentation that need to be addressed. Nothing criminal, of course, but we need to ensure everything is properly documented going forward. That word irregularities hung in the air like smoke. I felt my pulse quicken as I studied her face. She was looking directly at me now, her expression sympathetic but firm, like a doctor delivering a diagnosis. There was something calculating in her eyes that I'd never noticed before, or perhaps I'd been too trusting to see it. "What kind of irregularities?" I asked, though part of me already dreaded the answer. Jessica exchanged a glance with our father before responding. "Well, for instance, the permit modifications on the Southeast Division project. The documentation doesn't quite match the city records. And there are some expense reports from the Hawthorne renovation that seem questionable." My hands clenched involuntarily under the table. The Southeast Division project had been one of our most challenging builds, requiring multiple permit modifications due to unexpected soil conditions and city planning changes. Every modification had been properly filed and approved. I had personally walked each document through the permitting office, building relationships with clerks and supervisors to ensure smooth processing. As for the Hawthorne renovation, every expense had been meticulously documented and approved by Robert himself. Jessica, I handled both those projects personally. Every permit modification was approved by the city planning office. Every expense was documented and submitted for approval. If there's a discrepancy, it's in the city's filing system, not our documentation. She nodded slowly.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
As if she'd expected this response. I'm sure you believe that, Alex, but when I cross-referenced our internal records with the city database, there are some inconsistencies. Nothing major, but enough to raise questions if we were ever audited by outside agencies. The way she emphasized outside agencies made my blood run cold. She wasn't talking about routine city inspections or standard compliance reviews. She was implying something far more serious. Robert cleared his throat, reclaiming control of the conversation. The bottom line is that Jessica will be handling all legal matters going forward. Alex, you'll continue managing day-to-day operations, but all contract negotiations, permit applications, and compliance documentation will go through Jessica's office. I stared at him, this man who had taught me to read blueprints when I was 10 years old, who had brought me to construction sites every weekend to show me the difference between good work and great work. The man who had always said that Chen Associates was a family business where trust and integrity were more valuable than profit margins. Dad, are you saying you don't trust my work anymore? His face softened slightly, and for a moment I saw the father I remembered rather than the CEO making strategic decisions. Alex, this isn't about trust, it's about protecting the company. The construction industry is under increasing scrutiny, and we need someone with formal legal credentials to ensure we're covered. But Jessica's expression told a different story. She was studying me with the intensity of someone analyzing a problem to be solved, not a family member to be protected. There was something predatory in her gaze that made me realize this conversation had been planned long before I walked into the room. When does this transition take effect? I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. Today, Jessica replied immediately. I've already scheduled meetings with our primary contractors this afternoon to introduce myself and review their current contracts. I want to make sure everything is properly structured moving forward. The speed of her response confirmed what I was beginning to suspect. This wasn't a sudden decision prompted by compliance concerns. This was a carefully orchestrated plan that had been in motion for weeks, possibly months. While I had been focused on building the company's reputation and client relationships, Jessica had been positioning herself to take control. I'll need all project files transferred to my office by end of business today, she continued, her tone becoming more businesslike. That includes all correspondence with city officials, contractor agreements, expense documentation, and client communications. I want to conduct a comprehensive review to ensure everything meets current legal standards. The request sent alarm bells ringing in my head. Those files contained 8 years of relationship building, negotiation strategies, and industry insights that had taken me nearly a decade to develop. They were the foundation of my professional identity at Chen Associates, and Jessica was asking me to hand them over like they were office supplies. Jessica, those files contain sensitive client information and ongoing negotiations. Some of those relationships took years to build. I think it would be better if we handled the transition more gradually, maybe work together for a few months until you're familiar with the operational side of the business. She shook her head with the confidence of someone who had already considered and dismissed that option. Alex, I appreciate your concern, but clean transitions are always better than gradual ones. Clients need to know who they're dealing with, and contractors need clear lines of authority. Having two people trying to manage the same relationships would only create confusion. Robert nodded in agreement, and I realized that whatever conversation had led to this decision, it had happened without me. My father and sister had discussed my professional future, weighed my contributions against Jessica's potential, and decided that I was the expendable one. Fine, I said, standing up from the table. I'll have everything transferred by 5 o'clock. As I walked toward the door, Jessica called after me. Alex, I want you to know that this isn't personal. It's just business. I think once you see how much more efficiently we can operate with proper legal oversight, you'll understand why this change was necessary. I turned back to look at her, this sister who had shared Christmas mornings and family vacations, who had asked for my help with math homework and borrowed my car during college. She was looking at me with the same expression she'd worn during MBA case study presentations, analytical, confident, and completely detached from any emotional consideration. Of course, I replied, just business. But as I walked back to my office, past the framed photos of completed projects and the certificates of appreciation from satisfied clients, I couldn't shake the feeling that Jessica's emphasis on compliance issues and irregularities was more than just professional thoroughness. There was something deliberate about the way she had mentioned specific projects, something that suggested she wasn't just reviewing documents but building a case. The morning sunlight that had seemed so bright in the conference room now felt harsh and unforgiving as it streamed through my office windows. I sat down at my desk and stared at the filing cabinets that contained 8 years of meticulous work, wondering if I was about to hand over the very documentation that would be used to destroy my career. My computer chimed with a new email notification, and I glanced at the screen to see a message from Jessica, sent just minutes after our meeting ended. The subject line read, Document Transfer Priority List. She had already prepared a detailed inventory of which files she wanted first, organized by project timeline and client importance. The efficiency was impressive and terrifying in equal measure. As I began pulling files from the cabinets, I couldn't help but notice that Jessica's priority list focused heavily on the projects she had mentioned during the meeting, the Southeast Division development and the Hawthorne renovation. The same projects where she claimed to have found irregularities in the documentation. I spent the rest of that Tuesday afternoon, boxing up files with mechanical precision, trying not to think about what Jessica might do with them. Each document I placed in the transfer boxes represented months of careful relationship building, strategic planning, and problem solving that had kept Chen Associates competitive in Portland's cutthroat construction market. The Hawthorne renovation alone had required 6 months of negotiations with historic preservation committees, neighborhood associations, and city planners. Those relationships couldn't be replicated by reading case studies in business school. Maria Rodriguez knocked on my office door around 3 o'clock, carrying 2 cups of coffee from the break room. She had been Robert's executive assistant for 15 years, long enough to witness every major decision and family drama that had shaped the company. Her expression told me she already knew about the morning's announcement. Rough day, she asked, settling into the chair across from my desk. Maria had a gift for understatement that made even the worst situations feel manageable. You could say that. I accepted the coffee gratefully, realizing I hadn't eaten anything since breakfast. I assume word has already spread about Jessica's promotion. Maria nodded slowly, her dark eyes reflecting years of watching office politics play out. The announcement went out to all department heads about an hour ago. Jessica's already scheduled individual meetings with every project manager for tomorrow morning. She wants to assess current operational protocols according to the email. The speed of Jessica's mobilization was breathtaking. Most people would have taken weeks to understand the scope of their new responsibilities before making sweeping changes. Jessica was implementing her agenda within hours of receiving the promotion, as if she had been planning these moves for months. Maria, can I ask you something? And I need you to be completely honest with me. She leaned forward slightly, her expression becoming more serious. Of course, have you noticed anything unusual about Jessica's interactions with the company over the past few months? Any meetings with Robert that seemed different? Any requests for information that struck you as odd? Maria was quiet for a long moment, clearly weighing her words carefully. As Robert's assistant, she was privy to information that could destroy careers if shared inappropriately. But she also understood the unspoken codes of loyalty that kept small companies functioning. About 3 months ago, Jessica started requesting copies of project files. She said she wanted to familiarize herself with the company's operations before her graduation. At first, it seemed reasonable. Recent MBA graduates often want to understand their family businesses better. But she was very specific about which projects she wanted to review. Not the most recent ones, or the most profitable ones. She asked specifically for files on projects that had required multiple permit modifications or had experienced cost overruns. Projects where there might have been documentation challenges. My stomach dropped. 3 months ago was when the Southeast Division project had encountered those soil issues that required extensive permit modifications. It was also when the Hawthorne renovation had faced unexpected structural problems that pushed us over budget. Both projects had been complex but ultimately successful, requiring creative problem solving and extensive documentation to satisfy city requirements. Did she say why she was interested in those particular projects? Maria shook her head. She said she wanted to understand how the company handled challenging situations. But Alex, I've been doing this job for 15 years. I know the difference between someone trying to learn and someone looking for problems. The implications were staggering. While I had been focused on completing those projects successfully, meeting deadlines, and maintaining client relationships, Jessica had been studying them for weaknesses. She hadn't been learning about the family business to contribute to its success. She had been conducting reconnaissance. There's something else, Maria continued, lowering her voice. Last week, Jessica requested access to the company's financial management system. She said she needed to understand our accounting procedures for her new role. But Robert gave her full access, including historical data going back 5 years. 5 years of financial records would include every expense report, every contractor payment, every permit fee, and every client invoice. It would also include the detailed documentation of how we had managed cost overruns on complex projects, how we had negotiated with suppliers during material shortages, and how we had structured payment schedules to maintain cash flow during lengthy permit approval processes. Maria, I need you to understand something. Every expense, every payment, every financial decision on those projects was properly documented and approved. If Jessica is implying there were irregularities, she's either misunderstanding the documentation or deliberately misrepresenting it. I believe you, Maria said without hesitation. I've processed your expense reports for 8 years. You're the most meticulous person in this company when it comes to documentation. But Alex, Jessica isn't looking for the truth. She's building a narrative. The word narrative hit me like ice water. In business school, they taught students to analyze case studies by identifying key decision points and alternative outcomes. Jessica wasn't reviewing my work to understand it. She was deconstructing it to find points of vulnerability that could be reframed as evidence of misconduct. My phone buzzed with another email from Jessica. This one requested an immediate meeting to discuss the transition timeline for my client relationships. She wanted to begin contacting clients directly by Thursday, less than 48 hours away. The speed was aggressive, even by Jessica's standards. I have to go, I told Maria, standing up and grabbing my jacket. Jessica wants to discuss transition protocols. Alex, be careful. I don't know what game she's playing, but she's been planning it for a long time. I walked down the hallway toward Jessica's new office, which had been converted from a conference room overnight. Robert had spared no expense in setting up her workspace. New furniture, state-of-the-art computer equipment, and a legal library that must have cost thousands of dollars. The message was clear. Jessica's position was permanent and well-funded. She was on the phone when I arrived, speaking in clipped, professional tones to someone about compliance standards and documentation requirements. When she saw me, she held up one finger and continued her conversation for another 5 minutes, making notes on a legal pad with practiced efficiency. Sorry about that, she said after hanging up. I was speaking with our insurance company about updating our liability coverage. Apparently there are some gaps in our current policy that could expose the company to significant risk. What kind of gaps? Jessica pulled out a thick folder and opened it with the flourish of someone presenting evidence. Well, for instance, our current policy doesn't adequately cover errors and omissions in permit applications. If a project were to face legal challenges due to documentation discrepancies, the company could be liable for significant damages. The specificity of her concern was unsettling. Errors and omissions in permit applications weren't a general industry risk. They were a very specific type of legal exposure that would only be relevant if someone was planning to challenge the validity of previously approved permits. Jessica, our permit applications have been approved by the City Planning Office for every project. If there were errors significant enough to invalidate permits, we would have heard from the city by now. She nodded sympathetically, but her expression remained clinical. I'm sure you believe that, Alex. But permit approval doesn't necessarily mean the application was completely accurate. Sometimes city officials approve applications based on incomplete information, and when that comes to light later, it can create serious legal problems. What are you implying? I'm not implying anything. I'm simply identifying potential risks that need to be addressed. For instance, the Southeast Division project received approval for a permit modification based on soil analysis reports. But when I reviewed the documentation, I noticed some inconsistencies between the initial geological survey and the subsequent analysis that justified the permit change. My hands clenched involuntarily. The Southeast Division soil analysis had been conducted by Portland Geological Services, one of the most respected firms in the region. When unexpected soil conditions were discovered during excavation, we had commissioned additional analysis to determine the best construction approach. The permit modification had been approved based on recommendations from licensed geological engineers. Those weren't inconsistencies, Jessica. They were additional findings based on more detailed analysis. That's standard procedure when initial surveys don't reveal the full scope of soil conditions. The City Planning Office reviewed both reports and approved the permit modification. I understand that's how you see it, she replied, making a note on her legal pad. But from a legal perspective, the timeline between the initial survey and the subsequent analysis raises questions about why the additional testing wasn't conducted initially. It could be interpreted as negligent project planning. The accusation was breathtaking in its audacity. Jessica was taking a standard industry practice, conducting additional geological analysis when unexpected conditions were discovered, and reframing it as evidence of negligence. Any construction professional would recognize this as proper procedure, but to someone unfamiliar with the industry, it could indeed appear suspicious. Jessica, additional soil testing is standard practice in construction. Every building inspector, every geological engineer, every construction manager in Portland would confirm that. You can't turn normal operational procedures into evidence of negligence. Perhaps, she said, closing the folder. But the insurance company wants comprehensive documentation of our risk management procedures. They're particularly interested in projects where permit modifications were required, or where cost overruns exceeded 10% of the original budget. Both the Southeast Division project and the Hawthorne renovation had exceeded their original budgets due to unforeseen complications. In both cases, clients had been informed immediately, additional funding had been secured through proper channels, and all expenses had been documented and approved. But Jessica was presenting these successful problem-solving efforts as red flags requiring insurance review. What exactly are you planning to tell the insurance company? Just the facts, she replied with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. I want to make sure they have complete information about our operational history so they can provide appropriate coverage recommendations. I stared at her across the polished surface of her new desk, trying to reconcile this calculating professional with the sister who had called me for advice during her first-year business school struggles. The Jessica I remembered had been uncertain, sometimes overwhelmed by the academic pressure and competitive environment. This Jessica was confident, strategic, and utterly ruthless in her approach to achieving her objectives. Is there anything else you need for the transition? I asked, standing up to leave. Actually, yes. I'd like you to prepare a comprehensive report detailing your decision-making process for the permit modifications on Southeast Division and the cost management strategies you employed on the Hawthorne renovation. I want to understand your reasoning, so I can better explain these projects to external stakeholders. The request was phrased as a learning opportunity, but I recognized it for what it was. Jessica wanted me to document my own decision-making process so she could analyze it for inconsistencies, question my judgment, and potentially use my own words as evidence of misconduct. How detailed do you want this report to be? Very detailed. I want to understand every factor that influenced your decisions, every alternative you considered, every stakeholder you consulted. The more comprehensive the documentation, the better I can represent the company's interests. I nodded and left her office, but my mind was racing. Jessica wasn't asking for a transition report. She was asking me to provide a written confession that she could dissect and reinterpret. Every decision I documented would be scrutinized for flaws. Every alternative I mentioned would be presented as evidence that I had chosen the wrong approach. Every stakeholder consultation would be questioned as insufficient due diligence. By the time I reached my car in the parking garage, I had reached an uncomfortable conclusion. Jessica's appointment as head of legal affairs wasn't just about bringing formal legal expertise to the company. It was the opening move in a larger strategy designed to remove me from Chen Associates entirely. She was systematically documenting everything that could be used to question my competence, challenge my integrity, or suggest that my continued employment represented a liability for the company. The evening traffic on SW Morrison Street gave me time to think about the pattern of Jessica's behavior over the past few months. Her requests for historical project files, her interest in projects with complications, her focus on permit modifications and cost overruns, her conversations with insurance companies about liability coverage. Each action seemed reasonable in isolation, but together they formed a comprehensive strategy for building a case against me. When I finally arrived home to my apartment in the Pearl District, I pulled out my laptop and began reviewing my own email communications from the past year. I wanted to understand what Jessica might have learned from the files she had reviewed, what vulnerabilities she might have identified, and what narrative she was constructing about my professional performance. The Southeast Division project emails told the story of a complex construction challenge handled with professional competence. When soil conditions proved more complicated than initial surveys indicated, I had immediately contacted geological consultants, informed the client of potential delays, and worked with city planners to determine the best modification approach. Every decision had been documented, every stakeholder had been consulted, and the final result had exceeded client expectations. But reading through the emails with Jessica's perspective in mind, I could see how she might reinterpret these events. The timeline between discovering soil problems and receiving permit approval could be presented as evidence of inadequate initial planning. The cost increases could be framed as poor budgeting, rather than unforeseen circumstances. The geological consultations could be characterized as reactive rather than proactive management. Jessica was constructing a narrative in which my successful management of complex projects became evidence of professional incompetence. She was taking industry standard practices and presenting them as deviations from proper procedure. Most importantly, she was doing all of this while positioning herself as the solution to problems she was creating. The Hawthorne renovation emails revealed a similar pattern. When structural analysis revealed that the historic building required more extensive foundation work than originally anticipated, I had worked with preservation specialists, structural engineers, and city historic committees to develop an approach that maintained the building's historic integrity while ensuring structural safety. The project had been completed on time and within the revised budget, earning recognition from the Portland Historic Preservation Society. But Jessica could easily reframe this success story as evidence of inadequate pre-construction analysis. She could question why structural issues weren't identified during the initial assessment, why cost estimates had proven
inaccurate, and why permit modifications had been necessary. To someone unfamiliar with historic preservation requirements, these normal complications could appear to be evidence of poor project management. As I sat in my apartment reviewing 8 years of professional achievement, I realized that Jessica had been conducting a forensic analysis of my career, looking for any decision that could be questioned, any outcome that could be improved, any process that could be criticized. She wasn't interested in understanding my work, she was building a case for my dismissal. The most disturbing aspect of Jessica's strategy was its sophistication. She wasn't making wild accusations or obviously false claims. Instead, she was taking legitimate business decisions and presenting them in the worst possible light. She was using her legal training to transform normal operational challenges into evidence of professional misconduct. My phone rang around 10 o'clock, interrupting my document review. The caller ID showed David Kim, our company accountant and one of my closest colleagues at Chen Associates. "Alex, we need to talk," he said without preamble. "Can you meet me for coffee tomorrow morning before work? There's something you need to know about Jessica's activities." "What kind of activities?" "The kind that could destroy your career if you don't start protecting yourself immediately." I agreed to meet David at 7:30 the next morning at Brew and Bean, the coffee shop near the office where employees often held informal meetings. As I hung up the phone, I realized that whatever game Jessica was playing, I was already several moves behind. She had been planning her strategy for months while I had been focused on building the company's success. That night, I barely slept. I kept thinking about Maria's observation that Jessica had been building a narrative rather than seeking the truth. Every document she had reviewed, every question she had asked, every meeting she had scheduled was designed to support a predetermined conclusion about my professional competence. By morning, I had reached a decision. If Jessica wanted to play games with my career, I needed to start playing the game myself. But first, I needed to understand exactly what kind of evidence she had been gathering and how she planned to use it against me. David was already waiting when I arrived at Brew and Bean, his usually cheerful demeanor replaced by grim concern. He had been Chen Associates accountant for 12 years, long enough to understand both the company's financial history and the family dynamics that influenced major decisions. "Alex, I'm going to tell you something that could get me fired if Jessica finds out," he began, stirring his coffee nervously. "But I think you deserve to know what's happening." "What did you find?" "Yesterday afternoon, Jessica requested detailed financial analysis for all projects you've managed over the past 3 years. She specifically wanted to see expense categorization, vendor payments, permit fees, and any budget modifications. She said she was conducting a comprehensive operational review. That seems reasonable for someone in her position." David shook his head. "Alex, I've been doing financial analysis for this company for 12 years. I know the difference between an operational review and a fishing expedition." Jessica wasn't looking for general financial patterns. She was looking for specific types of transactions that could be questioned or reinterpreted. "What kind of transactions?" "Payments to geological consultants, fees for expedited permit processing, cost overruns that required client approval, vendor relationships that might appear preferential. Every financial decision that required judgment calls or involved relationships you had built over the years." The implications were staggering. Jessica was conducting a forensic financial analysis designed to identify any transaction that could be presented as inappropriate, even if it had been completely legitimate and properly approved at the time. "David, every payment you're describing was documented and approved according to company procedures. Robert signed off on every major expense personally. I know that, and you know that. But Jessica is building a case that Robert's approval was based on incomplete or misleading information that you provided. She's suggesting that your expense reports didn't fully disclose the nature of certain relationships or the necessity of certain expenditures. That's ridiculous. Every expense report included detailed explanations and supporting documentation. Alex, listen to me carefully. Jessica isn't interested in whether your explanations were accurate. She's interested in whether they were complete enough to satisfy legal scrutiny. She's applying legal standards to business decisions that were made under time pressure with incomplete information." I felt my stomach clench as I began to understand the scope of Jessica's strategy. She was taking normal business operations and subjecting them to legal analysis that no operational decision could withstand. Every judgment call, every relationship-based decision, every time-sensitive choice could be presented as evidence of improper procedure when viewed through the lens of legal perfection rather than business reality. "There's more," David continued. "This morning, Jessica scheduled a meeting with our external auditing firm. She wants them to conduct a comprehensive review of all financial procedures and documentation for the past 3 years. She's telling them that she's concerned about potential compliance issues that need to be addressed before they become legal problems." The external audit was the final piece of Jessica's strategy. She was bringing in outside professionals who would analyze my work without understanding the context, relationships, or time pressures that had influenced my decisions. They would apply standard accounting procedures to unique situations that had required creative problem solving and relationship management. "When is this audit scheduled to begin?" "Next Monday. Jessica wants results within 2 weeks." I stared out the window at the morning traffic on SW Morrison Street, watching Portland's business community begin another day of normal operations while my professional world collapsed around me. Jessica had constructed a timeline that would allow her to present audit findings to Robert and potentially to external authorities before I could mount any kind of defense. "David, I need you to do something for me, and I need you to think carefully before you agree because it could put your job at risk." He leaned forward, his expression serious. "What do you need?" I need copies of the financial analysis Jessica requested. I need to understand exactly what she's planning to present as evidence of misconduct so I can prepare my response. Alex, that could be considered theft of company documents. Those documents represent 8 years of my professional work. If Jessica is planning to use them to destroy my career, I have a right to see what case she's building against me. David was quiet for a long moment, clearly weighing the ethical implications of my request against his loyalty to a colleague who had always treated him with respect and fairness. I'll see what I can do, he finally said. But Alex, you need to understand something. Jessica isn't just building a case against you. She's building a case that will protect the company from any liability associated with your work. If she can prove that you acted outside established procedures, even if those actions were successful, she can insulate Chen Associates from any future legal challenges. You're saying she's planning to make me a scapegoat. I'm saying she's planning to make you legally expendable. As I walked back to the office, I realized that Jessica's strategy was even more sophisticated than I had initially understood. She wasn't just trying to remove me from the company. She was trying to ensure that if any of my past decisions ever faced legal scrutiny, Chen and Associates could claim that I had acted without proper authorization, outside established procedures, and contrary to company policy. By the time I reached my office, Jessica had already sent another email requesting a meeting to discuss documentation standards for the transition report she had asked me to prepare. She wanted to ensure that my analysis of the Southeast Division and Hawthorne renovation decisions met legal sufficiency standards for potential external review. I stared at the email for several minutes, recognizing it for what it was. Jessica was asking me to write my own termination letter, documenting every decision that could be questioned and every process that could be improved. She wanted me to provide the evidence that would justify my dismissal and protect the company from any legal consequences of my removal. For the first time since Tuesday morning's meeting, I smiled. Jessica's strategy was brilliant, comprehensive, and utterly dependent on my cooperation. She needed me to participate in my own destruction by providing detailed documentation of my decision-making process. But I wasn't going to make it that easy for her. I spent Wednesday morning crafting my response to Jessica's documentation request with surgical precision. Instead of providing the comprehensive self-incrimination she was expecting, I prepared a brief summary that referenced proper procedures and successful outcomes without detailing the vulnerable decision-making processes she could exploit. Every sentence was factual, every claim was supportable, and every conclusion emphasized compliance with industry standards. The Southeast Division summary focused on adherence to geological engineering recommendations and city planning requirements. I documented consultation with licensed professionals, approval from appropriate regulatory bodies, and client satisfaction with the final outcome. Nothing in my response could be twisted into evidence of negligence or misconduct, because I stuck strictly to verifiable facts and avoided any commentary that could be reinterpreted. For the Hawthorne renovation, I emphasized the project's recognition by the Portland Historic Preservation Society and its completion within the revised timeline and budget. I referenced the structural engineering reports that had justified the scope modifications and the City Historic Committee approvals that had validated our preservation approach. Again, every statement was factual and defensible. When I delivered the reports to Jessica's office that afternoon, her expression suggested she had been expecting something far more detailed and vulnerable. She flipped through the pages quickly, her professional smile becoming more strained with each concise paragraph. "This is quite brief," she observed, setting the documents on her desk. "I was hoping for more insight into your analytical process and decision-making methodology. Everything you need is documented in the project files," I replied evenly. My job was to deliver successful outcomes for clients while maintaining compliance with city regulations. Both projects achieved those objectives. Yes, but I'm interested in understanding the reasoning behind specific choices. For instance, why did you select Portland Geological Services for the additional soil analysis rather than seeking competitive bids from multiple firms? The question revealed how little Jessica understood about construction operations. Portland Geological Services had conducted the original survey and possessed comprehensive knowledge of the site conditions. Bringing in a different firm would have required starting the analysis from scratch, causing weeks of delays and potentially inconsistent findings. Portland Geological Services had the most complete understanding of the site conditions, I explained. Using a different firm would have compromised timeline requirements and potentially produced conflicting analysis. But from a financial perspective, wouldn't competitive bidding have ensured the most cost-effective solution? Jessica, we're talking about a 2-week timeline to resolve a construction delay that was costing the client thousands of dollars daily. Competitive bidding would have taken longer than the actual analysis. She made a note on her legal pad, but her expression suggested she wasn't satisfied with my explanation. I understand time was a factor, but proper procurement procedures exist for good reasons. Deviation from established protocols can expose the company to claims of favoritism or inadequate oversight. There was no favoritism involved. Portland Geological Services was the most qualified firm for the specific requirements of that project. Any construction professional would have made the same decision under those circumstances. Perhaps, but external reviewers might not understand the construction industry context. They might see a pattern of vendor relationships that appear preferential rather than merit-based. The word external reviewers sent a chill down my spine. Jessica wasn't just questioning my decisions for internal purposes. She was preparing explanations for outside authorities, who would evaluate my work without understanding the industry context that made my choices not just reasonable but necessary. Jessica, what external reviewers are you referring to? Oh, just our insurance company and the auditing firm. They like to understand decision-making processes when they're evaluating coverage and compliance. It's standard procedure for companies our size. But her tone suggested there was nothing standard about the level of scrutiny she was inviting. Insurance companies and auditors typically focused on financial controls and regulatory compliance, not operational decision-making processes. Jessica was specifically directing their attention toward areas where my judgment could be questioned. Is there anything else you need for your review? I asked, standing to leave. Actually, yes. I'd like to schedule individual meetings with the contractors you work with most frequently. I want to understand their perspective on our operational procedures and documentation requirements. My blood ran cold. The contractors I worked with were loyal business partners who had built successful relationships with Chen Associates over years of mutual respect and fair dealing. But they were also business people who would prioritize their own interests if they sensed potential legal problems with our company. What specifically do you want to discuss with them? Just general operational feedback. I want to understand how they perceive our contract management, payment procedures, and change order processes. It's part of my comprehensive operational review. Jessica, these contractors have worked with us for years without any problems. They trust our procedures and value our professional relationships. Suggesting that we're reviewing our operational standards could damage those relationships unnecessarily. Alex, I'm not suggesting there are problems. I'm ensuring that our procedures meet current industry standards and legal requirements. If our contractors are as satisfied as you say, then these conversations will only reinforce confidence in our operations. But I knew better. Contractors would interpret Jessica's questions as evidence that Chen Associates was facing potential legal problems. They would become cautious about future commitments, more demanding about contract terms, and less willing to work with us on the relationship-based arrangements that made complex projects manageable. When are you planning these meetings? Tomorrow and Friday. I want to complete the operational review before the external audit begins next week. The timeline was deliberately compressed. Jessica was conducting her contractor interviews just before the external audit, ensuring that any concerns or questions they raised would be fresh in the auditor's minds. She was also timing these conversations to occur before I could speak with the contractors privately to explain the context of her inquiry. That evening, I called Tom Morrison, the owner of Morrison Construction Services and one of our most reliable subcontractors. Tom had worked with Chen Associates for 6 years, handling electrical and plumbing installations for most of our major projects. He was also someone who valued straight talk and honest business relationships. Tom, I wanted to give you a heads up about something. Jessica Chen is going to be calling to schedule a meeting with you about our operational procedures. Jessica, I thought you handled all the contractor relationships. There's been a restructuring. Jessica is now head of legal affairs, and she's conducting a comprehensive review of our operations. She wants to get contractor feedback on our procedures. Tom was quiet for a moment. Alex, is there something I need to be concerned about? Because when companies start bringing lawyers in to talk to contractors, it usually means somebody's worried about liability issues. There's nothing to be concerned about from your perspective, but I wanted you to understand that this review is focused on compliance and documentation rather than relationship management or project outcomes. What exactly is she going to ask me? Probably questions about contract management, change order procedures, payment processes, that kind of thing. She's looking to ensure everything meets current legal standards. Alex, you know our contracts have always been straightforward. We agree on scope and price. We do the work. You pay us on time. We've never had any legal problems because we keep things simple and honest. I know that, and Jessica should understand that too. But she's approaching our operations from a legal perspective rather than a practical one. She might ask about things that seem like problems to her but are actually standard industry practices. Tom sighed. Look, Alex, you've always been fair with us. Our payment terms are better with Chen Associates than with most of our other clients. But if there's legal uncertainty around your company, I need to know about it. I can't afford to get caught up in someone else's compliance problems. There are no compliance problems, Tom. This is a proactive review, not a response to any issues. But I wanted you to understand the context so you wouldn't be caught off guard by the questions. I appreciate the heads up. I'll answer her questions honestly. But Alex, if this review suggests there are problems with your operations, it's going to change how we structure our future contracts. After hanging up, I realized that Jessica's contractor meetings would accomplish exactly what she intended, regardless of the actual content of the conversations. The mere fact that Chen Associates was subjecting contractor relationships to legal review would create uncertainty and caution among our business partners. I made similar calls to 3 other key contractors, providing the same context and warnings. Each conversation followed a similar pattern. These business partners trusted me personally and valued their relationships with Chen Associates, but they were also practical people who would protect their own interests if they sensed potential legal problems. Thursday morning brought an email from Jessica requesting an urgent meeting to discuss preliminary findings from her operational review. The tone was professional but carried an undercurrent of concern that suggested she had discovered something significant. When I arrived at her office, she had organized her desk like a prosecutor preparing for trial, with labeled folders, highlighted documents, and a legal pad covered with detailed notes. "Thank you for coming so quickly," she began, gesturing for me to sit across from her desk. "I've been reviewing the documentation and contractor feedback from this week, and I've identified some issues that need immediate attention." "What kind of issues?" Jessica opened the first folder and pulled out a series of highlighted documents. "Let's start with the Southeast Division project. I've been analyzing the timeline between the discovery of soil problems and the permit modification approval, and there are some concerning gaps in the documentation." She spread out several pages across her desk, pointing to specific dates and signatures. The geological analysis that justified the permit modification was completed on March 15, but the permit application wasn't submitted until March 22. That's a 7-day delay that isn't explained in any of the project documentation. Jessica, that 7-day period was spent coordinating with the client, reviewing cost implications, and preparing the permit application documentation. You can't submit permit modifications without proper preparation and client approval. But there's no formal documentation of those coordination activities. No meeting notes, no email confirmations, no signed change orders. From a legal perspective, it appears that work proceeded without proper authorization. The work didn't proceed. We stopped construction until the permit modification was approved. The delay was specifically to ensure we had proper authorization before continuing. Then why isn't that documented? Why isn't there a formal work stoppage order or a client notification of the delay? I stared at her across the desk, recognizing the impossible standard she was applying to normal business operations. Every construction project involved dozens of informal conversations, email exchanges, and phone calls that weren't formally documented because they represented routine coordination rather than major decisions. "Jessica, construction management involves constant communication and coordination that doesn't require formal documentation. We don't create meeting notes every time we discuss project status with clients. But when work stoppages and permit modifications are involved, shouldn't there be more comprehensive documentation? What if the client later claimed they weren't properly informed about delays or cost implications? The client was completely informed and satisfied with our handling of the situation. That's why they hired us for 2 additional projects after Southeast Division was completed. Client satisfaction doesn't necessarily mean the documentation meets legal sufficiency standards. If this project were ever subject to dispute resolution or regulatory review, the lack of formal documentation could be problematic." Jessica moved to the second folder, pulling out financial records and contractor agreements. "I've also identified some concerns about the Hawthorne renovation project. The structural engineering costs exceeded the original budget by 38%, but the change order documentation doesn't clearly establish why the additional work was necessary. The additional work was necessary because structural analysis revealed foundation issues that weren't visible during initial assessment. The structural engineer provided a detailed report explaining the scope of required work. Yes, but the report was prepared by the same engineering firm that conducted the initial assessment. Should an independent analysis have been obtained when the original assessment proved inadequate? Jessica, structural engineering firms take responsibility for their initial assessments. When they discover additional issues, they have professional liability for providing accurate solutions. Bringing in a different firm would have compromised accountability and potentially delayed the project for months. But from a legal perspective, using the same firm that made the initial error could be seen as allowing them to cover their mistakes rather than ensuring objective analysis. It wasn't an error. Historic buildings often reveal structural issues that aren't apparent until renovation work begins. That's why structural engineers carry professional liability insurance and maintain ongoing responsibility for their recommendations. Jessica made extensive notes as I explained the structural engineering process, but her expression suggested she was documenting my responses for future reference rather than accepting my explanations. She was creating a record of our conversation that could later be used to demonstrate that I had defended questionable practices when presented with legitimate concerns. There's one more issue I need to discuss, she continued, opening a third folder. I've been reviewing your contractor relationships, and I've noticed some patterns that could be interpreted as preferential treatment rather than competitive procurement. What patterns? Over the past 3 years, 67% of our electrical work has been awarded to Morrison Construction Services, and 59% of our plumbing contracts have gone to Pacific Northwest Mechanical. Those percentages suggest relationship-based selection rather than competitive bidding. Those contractors consistently provide the best combination of quality, price, and reliability. They understand our standards and deliver results that satisfy our clients. But without competitive bidding for each project, how can you demonstrate that they're providing the most cost-effective solutions? Jessica, construction isn't like purchasing office supplies. Contractor relationships involve trust, communication, and understanding of specific requirements. The lowest bid doesn't necessarily represent the best value when quality and reliability are factors. I understand that, but external reviewers might not appreciate the nuances of contractor relationships. They might see a pattern of award decisions that appear to violate competitive procurement principles. There are no competitive procurement requirements for private construction companies. We're free to work with contractors who provide the best value for our clients. That's true from a legal standpoint, but from an ethical perspective, shouldn't we ensure that all qualified contractors have equal opportunity to compete for our business? The conversation was becoming surreal. Jessica was applying public sector procurement standards to private business operations, suggesting that normal relationship-based contractor selection represented ethical problems rather than sound business practice. Jessica, what exactly are you recommending? I think we need to implement more comprehensive documentation standards and competitive procurement procedures. I also think we should consider engaging independent consultants to review our operational procedures and ensure they meet current industry standards. Independent consultants was another way of saying external investigators who would analyze our operations without understanding the context, relationships, or practical considerations that made our current procedures effective. When do you want to implement these changes?
Immediately.
I've already prepared a draft policy requiring competitive bidding for all contracts over $10,000 and formal documentation for all client communications regarding scope changes or cost modifications. Jessica handed me a typed document that looked like it had been prepared by someone with extensive legal training and no practical construction experience. The proposed policy would add weeks to project timelines, create unnecessary paperwork for routine decisions, and potentially damage contractor relationships that had taken years to develop. Jessica, this policy would fundamentally change how we operate. It would affect our competitiveness, our client relationships, and our project timelines. Change is necessary when current practices expose the company to potential liability. These procedures will protect Chen Associates from questions about our operational standards. They'll also make us less efficient, more expensive, and harder to work with than our competitors. Perhaps, but they'll also make us legally defensible. In today's business environment, legal protection is more important than operational convenience. I looked at Jessica across her organized desk, recognizing that this conversation represented the final phase of her strategy. She had identified vulnerabilities in my work, documented concerns about my procedures, and prepared policy recommendations that would prevent anyone from operating the way I had operated for 8 years. Is there anything else you need from me for your review?
Actually, yes.
I'd like you to prepare a response to these concerns for the external audit next week. I want to ensure that you have an opportunity to address these issues before the auditors begin their review. What kind of response? A detailed explanation of your decision-making process for each of the issues I've identified, along with your recommendations for addressing the documentation and procurement concerns. Jessica was asking me to write a comprehensive defense of my professional practices, knowing that anything I wrote would be analyzed for inconsistencies, questioned for completeness, and potentially used as evidence that I
Recognize problems with my own work. I'll prepare something over the weekend, I said, standing to leave. Thank you, Alex. I know this is difficult, but I want to make sure we address these issues proactively, rather than waiting for external parties to identify them. As I walked back to my office, I realized that Jessica's review had accomplished everything she had intended. She had documented questionable aspects of my work, obtained contractor feedback that could be interpreted as concerning, and created a comprehensive record of operational issues that required immediate attention. Most importantly, she had positioned herself as the solution to problems she had identified. The professional whose legal expertise was necessary to protect Chen Associates from the liability created by my operational approach. The external audit beginning Monday would review her documentation, interview the contractors she had spoken with, and analyze the concerns she had raised. They would conclude that Chen Associates needed stronger legal oversight, more comprehensive documentation standards, and different operational leadership. Jessica had spent months building a case for my removal that would appear to be based on objective analysis rather than family politics. She had transformed my operational success into evidence of legal vulnerability, my contractor relationships into evidence of preferential treatment, and my problem-solving abilities into evidence of inadequate procedures. By Friday afternoon, I understood that I was facing a choice between participating in my own professional destruction or finding a way to expose the manipulation behind Jessica's legal concerns. But exposing Jessica would require proof that her review was motivated by personal ambition rather than legitimate business concerns, and she had been careful to ensure that all her actions appeared professionally motivated. I spent Friday evening reviewing every document, every email, and every conversation from the past week, looking for evidence that Jessica's operational concerns were pretextual rather than genuine. But she had been thorough in her approach, ensuring that every question she raised and every issue she identified could be defended as legitimate business concerns. The weekend ahead would be my last opportunity to prepare a defense before the external audit began. But I was beginning to realize that defending myself against Jessica's accusations wasn't enough. I needed to find a way to turn her own strategy against her, to expose the manipulation behind her professional facade. The question was whether I could do it before Monday morning, when the external auditors arrived to begin their review of 8 years of my professional work, guided by Jessica's careful documentation of every vulnerability she had identified. Saturday morning arrived with the kind of crisp autumn air that usually energized me for weekend project planning, but instead I found myself sitting in my apartment, staring at Jessica's policy draft, and wondering how to salvage 8 years of professional reputation. The external audit was scheduled to begin Monday at 9 o'clock, and I had less than 48 hours to prepare a response that could somehow neutralize months of Jessica's strategic preparation. David had managed to provide me with copies of the financial analysis Jessica had requested, and reading through her annotations revealed the sophisticated nature of her attack. She hadn't fabricated any evidence or made obviously false claims. Instead, she had taken legitimate business decisions and subjected them to legal scrutiny that made normal operational choices appear questionable to anyone unfamiliar with construction industry practices. Her analysis of the Southeast Division geological consulting fees focused on the lack of competitive bidding documentation, suggesting that my relationship with Portland Geological Services might have influenced the vendor selection process. She had calculated that competitive bidding could have potentially saved the company 12% on consulting costs, without acknowledging that the time required for competitive bidding would have cost the client thousands of dollars in construction delays. For the Hawthorne renovation, Jessica had identified what she called scope creep patterns in the structural engineering modifications, suggesting that inadequate initial assessment had led to cost overruns that could have been avoided with more thorough pre-construction analysis. Her financial analysis ignored the reality that historic preservation projects routinely encounter unforeseen structural issues that can't be identified until renovation work begins. But the most damaging aspect of Jessica's analysis was her systematic questioning of my expense categorization decisions.
She had identified dozens of charges that could have been categorized differently, presenting alternative classifications that would have made certain projects appear more profitable or certain vendor relationships appear more balanced. None of her suggested changes were obviously correct, but they created an impression that my financial reporting might have been strategically structured to obscure unfavorable patterns. As I reviewed her work, I began to understand that Jessica's real genius lay not in finding actual problems but in creating the appearance of problems that would require ongoing legal oversight to prevent. She was positioning herself as indispensable by making my operational approach appear legally risky, even when it was practically effective. My phone rang around 10 o'clock, interrupting my document review. The caller ID showed Tom Morrison's number, and his voice carried the kind of tension that usually preceded bad news. "Alex, I wanted to give you a heads up about my meeting with your sister yesterday. I think there might be some things you need to know about the direction of these conversations." "What did she ask you about?" "Well, she started with general questions about our contract procedures and payment terms, which seemed reasonable enough. But then she got into more specific territory that made me uncomfortable." "What kind of specific territory?" "She asked about verbal agreements, informal scope modifications, things like emergency work authorizations when you needed something done quickly to keep projects on schedule. She wanted to know how often we proceeded with work based on your verbal approval rather than formal written change orders." My stomach clenched. Emergency work authorizations were a normal part of construction management, used when delays would cost clients more than the additional work itself. Every contractor understood that formal paperwork would follow, but work needed to proceed immediately to prevent larger problems. "What did you tell her?" "I told her the truth. That you've always been good about formalizing agreements after the fact, but that sometimes construction schedules require immediate decisions. I explained that we trust your word, because you've never failed to honor a verbal commitment. That should have been fine. That's standard industry practice." "Alex, that's what I thought too." But she started asking about documentation timelines, about how long it typically took between verbal authorization and formal paperwork. She wanted to know if there were ever situations where formal documentation was delayed or never completed. The implications were staggering. Jessica was building a case that I routinely authorized work without proper documentation, creating liability exposure for the company, and potentially violating contract terms with clients. She was taking normal operational flexibility and presenting it as evidence of inadequate controls. "Tom, did she ask about any specific projects or situations?" "She asked about the Southeast Division electrical work when we had to reroute systems because of the soil problems. She wanted to know how quickly we moved on that modification and whether we had formal authorization before starting the work. We discussed that modification during our site meeting on March 18th. You started work the next day based on our conversation, and I submitted the formal change order on March 22nd after getting client approval for the additional costs." "I know that, and I told her exactly what happened, but Alex, she kept asking about the timing. Why the work started before the formal paperwork was complete, whether the client had actually approved the additional costs before we began, whether there was any documentation of our verbal agreement." "What did you tell her about the documentation?" "I told her there wasn't any written record of our conversation because we've worked together long enough that verbal agreements are sufficient until formal paperwork catches up. But I could tell from her reaction that she saw this as a problem rather than normal business practice." Tom's description confirmed my worst fears about Jessica's contractor interviews. She was using these conversations to document operational practices that could be presented as evidence of inadequate controls, even though they represented standard industry procedures that every construction company employed. "Tom, did she ask about any other projects?" "She asked about payment terms, about whether we ever received payment before formal invoicing was complete, about how we handled emergency repairs that required immediate material purchases. Basically, she was documenting every aspect of our working relationship that involves trust and flexibility rather than formal procedures." "How did the conversation end?" "She thanked me for my candor and said she was working to ensure that all company procedures met current legal standards. But Alex, I got the impression that she was building a case rather than conducting a routine review. The questions were too specific and too focused on potential liability issues." After hanging up with Tom, I called Pacific Northwest Mechanical to speak with Sarah Chen, no relation despite the shared surname, who handled most of our plumbing installations. Her description of Jessica's questions followed a similar pattern, focusing on informal arrangements, verbal authorizations, and documentation timelines that could be presented as evidence of inadequate oversight. Alex, I've been in this business for 20 years, and I've never had a client's legal department ask such detailed questions about our working arrangements. Sarah told me. It felt like she was looking for problems rather than trying to understand our procedures. Did she ask about specific projects? She asked about the Hawthorne renovation plumbing modifications when we discovered those pipe issues behind the historic walls. She wanted to know exactly when we started work, whether we had written authorization, how long it took to get formal approval for the additional costs. What did you tell her? I told her what happened. That you approved emergency work to prevent water damage, that we started immediately to protect the building, and that formal paperwork was completed within a week. But she kept asking about liability exposure and insurance coverage, like she was worried about potential claims. What kind of claims? She asked whether our insurance would cover work performed without formal written authorization, whether the building owner could claim damages if our emergency work wasn't properly documented, whether there were potential disputes about change order pricing. Sarah's description revealed another dimension of Jessica's strategy. She wasn't just documenting operational practices that could be questioned. She was identifying potential legal vulnerabilities that could be presented to insurance companies and external auditors as evidence that Chen Associates needed stronger oversight and different operational leadership. Sarah, did she ask about our overall business relationship? She asked about the percentage of our work that comes from Chen Associates, whether we provide preferential pricing because of our ongoing relationship, whether we ever accept work at reduced rates to maintain the business connection. What did you tell her? I told her we provide competitive pricing because we value the relationship, but that we're not giving you discounts that hurt our business. I explained that long-term relationships allow for efficiency gains that benefit everyone. How did she respond to that? She asked whether those efficiency gains were documented, whether our pricing structure could be audited to verify competitive rates, whether external reviewers might interpret our relationship as preferential treatment rather than legitimate business efficiency. By Sunday afternoon, I had spoken with 5 contractors who had been interviewed by Jessica, and each conversation revealed the same pattern. She was systematically documenting every aspect of our business relationships that involved trust, flexibility, or informal arrangements. She was creating a comprehensive record of operational practices that could be presented as evidence of inadequate legal oversight. But more importantly, she was building a case that would require ongoing legal supervision to prevent liability exposure. Every informal arrangement she documented created justification for formal procedures that would require legal review. Every trust-based relationship she questioned created justification for competitive bidding requirements that would require legal oversight. Jessica wasn't just preparing to remove me from operational responsibilities. She was creating a business case for centralizing all significant decisions under legal department authority, effectively making herself the most powerful person at Chen Associates after Robert. Sunday evening, I finally understood the full scope of Jessica's strategy. She had used her MBA training to analyze the company's vulnerabilities, her legal knowledge to identify potential compliance issues, and her family position to gain access to confidential information. She had then systematically documented every aspect of my work that could be questioned, ensuring that external auditors would recommend changes that would eliminate my operational authority. But understanding Jessica's strategy also revealed its primary weakness. Her entire approach depended on presenting normal business practices as legal problems that required professional oversight to resolve. If I could demonstrate that her concerns were either overblown or motivated by personal ambition rather than legitimate business risks, I could potentially expose the manipulation behind her professional facade. The question was whether I could gather sufficient evidence before Monday morning's audit to prove that Jessica was manufacturing problems rather than identifying genuine compliance issues. I spent Sunday night preparing 2 documents. The first was the response Jessica had requested, addressing her operational concerns with detailed explanations that demonstrated industry standard practices and successful outcomes. The second was a comprehensive analysis of Jessica's methodology, highlighting the selective nature of her review and the predetermined conclusions that seemed to drive her questioning. Monday morning arrived with unexpected precipitation, the kind of steady drizzle that made Portland's autumn feel oppressive and uncertain. I arrived at the office early, hoping to speak with Robert before the external auditors began their review, but Jessica had apparently anticipated this strategy. Robert was already in meetings with the audit team, reviewing Jessica's preliminary findings and discussing the scope of their investigation. Maria intercepted me in the hallway outside Robert's office, her expression grave. "Alex, you need to know that Jessica provided the auditors with extensive documentation about operational concerns. They've been here since 7:30 reviewing her analysis." "What kind of documentation?" "Financial records, contractor interview summaries, compliance gap analysis, risk assessment reports. She's prepared a comprehensive briefing package that makes this look like a response to serious compliance problems rather than a routine operational review." "How is Robert responding to her presentation?" "He seems concerned about the potential liability issues she's identified. She's presenting everything as proactive risk management rather than criticism of your work, but the implication is clear that changes are necessary to protect the company." I realized that Jessica had structured her presentation to make Robert feel responsible for protecting the company from problems she had identified, rather than making him choose between his children's competing professional claims. She was leveraging his business instincts and parental protectiveness to support her recommendations without forcing him to explicitly take sides. "Maria, can you tell me exactly what documentation she provided to the auditors?" "She gave them copies of the financial analysis, summaries of contractor interviews, samples of project documentation that illustrate her concerns, and policy recommendations for addressing the issues she's identified." "Did she provide any context about industry standards or normal operational practices?" "Not that I saw. Her presentation focused on legal compliance and risk management rather than construction industry norms." The selective presentation confirmed my suspicions about Jessica's methodology. She was providing auditors with information that supported predetermined conclusions while omitting context that would help them understand the practical necessity of the practices she was questioning. "Maria, I need you to do something that might be difficult. I need you to provide the auditors with additional context about our operational history and industry practices. Can you arrange for me to speak with them before they complete their review?" Alex, Jessica specifically requested that all communication with the auditors go through her office. She said she wants to ensure consistent messaging and prevent any confusion about company positions. She's controlling the information flow to ensure the auditors reach the conclusions she wants them to reach. I understand that, but I'm not in a position to override her instructions without direct authorization from Robert. I spent Monday morning watching Jessica orchestrate the audit process with impressive efficiency. She provided guided tours of our project documentation, facilitated interviews with selected employees, and answered auditor questions with the confidence of someone who had prepared extensively for their inquiries. But I also noticed that Jessica was carefully controlling which information the auditors accessed and which employees they interviewed. She scheduled meetings with administrative staff, who could speak to procedural compliance but avoided operational managers, who could explain the practical necessity of flexible arrangements. She provided financial documentation that highlighted questionable patterns while omitting client satisfaction surveys and project success metrics. Around noon, David approached my office with the kind of expression that suggested he had discovered something significant. "Alex, I've been reviewing the financial documentation Jessica provided to the auditors, and I think there's something you need to understand about her analysis." "What did you find?" "She's using accounting classifications that make certain decisions appear questionable, even when they were completely appropriate. For instance, she's categorizing geological consulting as unplanned expenses rather than scope modifications, which makes it appear that you failed to anticipate necessary costs, rather than properly managing unforeseen conditions. That's a misrepresentation of what actually happened." "I know that, but it's a subtle misrepresentation that would be difficult for auditors to detect without understanding the specific context of each project. She's using her legal training to present facts in the most unfavorable light possible." "Can you document the correct classifications?" "I can, but Jessica has already provided the auditors with her interpretation, and changing accounting classifications after an audit begins would appear defensive rather than corrective." David's observation revealed another sophisticated aspect of Jessica's strategy. She wasn't falsifying information, but she was presenting it in ways that supported negative conclusions about my professional competence. The auditors would base their findings on her selective presentation, unless I could provide compelling alternative interpretations. "David, what would it take to demonstrate that Jessica's classifications are incorrect or misleading?" You'd need to show that her interpretations don't align with standard accounting practices for construction companies, or that her conclusions ignore industry context that makes your decisions reasonable rather than questionable. Can you prepare that kind of analysis? I can, but it would take several days to develop comprehensive alternative interpretations, and the auditors are scheduled to complete their review by Wednesday. The timeline pressure was another element of Jessica's strategy. She had compressed the audit schedule to prevent comprehensive response to her allegations, ensuring that auditors would base their conclusions on her presentation rather than balanced analysis of available information. Tuesday morning brought a request from Jessica for an interview with the audit team about my operational decision-making processes. The invitation was professionally phrased, but the timing and context made it clear that this would be an interrogation rather than a discussion. They'd like to understand your perspective on the operational issues that have been identified, Jessica explained when she called to schedule the meeting. I want to make sure you have an opportunity to address their questions before they finalize their findings. What kinds of questions are they planning to ask? General questions about your decision-making methodology, your approach to vendor relationships, your documentation practices. They want to understand your reasoning for the choices that have been highlighted in the review. Jessica, the choices that have been highlighted are normal construction industry practices. Any operational manager would have made similar decisions under similar circumstances. That may be true, but the auditors need to understand your specific reasoning so they can evaluate whether those practices meet current compliance standards. The interview was scheduled for Tuesday afternoon, giving me less than 24 hours to prepare responses to questions about 8 years of operational decisions. Jessica had provided the auditors with months of analysis supporting negative interpretations of my work, while I would have 2 hours to explain why their concerns were unfounded. Tuesday morning I made a decision that would either save my career or destroy it completely. Instead of preparing defensive responses to Jessica's allegations, I would present evidence that her entire review was motivated by personal ambition rather than legitimate business concerns. I spent the morning documenting the timeline of Jessica's activities, from her initial requests for historical project files through her systematic analysis of potential vulnerabilities. I prepared a comprehensive presentation showing how her concerns aligned with MBA case study methodologies, rather than practical compliance requirements. Most importantly, I documented how Jessica's policy recommendations would centralize operational authority under legal department oversight, effectively making her the most powerful person at Chen Associates after Robert. Her compliance concerns weren't about protecting the company from liability, they were about consolidating control over company operations. When I arrived for the Tuesday afternoon interview, I found Jessica seated at the conference table with 2 external auditors and Robert. The setup was clearly designed to be intimidating, with Jessica positioned as my professional superior, and the auditors prepared to question my competence based on her analysis. Thank you for joining us, Alex, Jessica began formally. We want to give you an opportunity to address some questions about your operational practices and decision-making processes. Before we begin, I replied, placing my own presentation materials on the table, I'd like to provide some context about the review process itself. Jessica's expression tightened slightly. Alex, we're here to discuss operational issues, not review methodologies. Actually, I think the methodology is directly relevant to understanding the operational issues. I opened my presentation and began walking through Jessica's systematic analysis of potential vulnerabilities, showing how her concerns aligned with theoretical business school approaches, rather than practical industry requirements. I demonstrated how her policy recommendations would require legal oversight for normal operational decisions, effectively centralizing power under her authority. What I'm showing you, I explained to the auditors, is that these compliance concerns are being used to justify fundamental changes in company operations that would eliminate operational flexibility and centralize decision-making authority. One of the auditors leaned forward, studying my documentation. Are you suggesting that the compliance issues identified in our review are not legitimate business concerns? I'm suggesting that normal construction industry practices are being presented as compliance problems that require legal oversight to resolve. Every concern that's been raised represents standard operational procedures that any construction company would employ. Jessica intervened quickly. Alex, the fact that certain practices are common doesn't mean they meet current legal standards or provide adequate protection from liability exposure. Jessica, these practices don't just meet legal standards, they exceed them. The concerns you've raised exist only when normal business operations are subjected to theoretical legal analysis that ignores practical industry requirements. I turned to Robert, who had been listening to this exchange with growing concern. Dad, for 8 years I've managed complex projects successfully, maintained excellent client relationships, and generated consistent profits for this company. Jessica is presenting that success as evidence of legal problems that require her oversight to resolve. Alex, I'm not questioning your success, Jessica replied smoothly. I'm identifying areas where our procedures could be strengthened to provide better legal protection. No, you're manufacturing problems that don't exist to justify centralizing operational control under legal department authority. Every concern you've raised, every policy you've recommended, every procedure you want to implement, serves the same purpose, making yourself indispensable, while making me expendable. The room fell silent as the implications of my accusations settled over everyone present. Jessica's face remained professionally composed, but I could see calculation behind her eyes as she prepared her response. Alex, I understand this process has been difficult for you, but personal attacks aren't going to address the legitimate compliance issues we've identified. These aren't personal attacks, they're professional observations about a systematic campaign to eliminate my operational authority by manufacturing compliance concerns that don't actually exist. Robert cleared his throat, reclaiming control of the conversation. I think we need to take a step back and focus on what's best for the company, rather than personal accusations. Dad, what's best for the company is recognizing that Jessica has been conducting a political campaign disguised as a compliance review. She's been building a case for months, not identifying problems but creating the appearance of problems that would justify her recommended solutions. One of the auditors spoke up, Mr. Chen, we've reviewed extensive documentation of operational practices that could potentially expose the company to liability. Are you suggesting that our findings are incorrect? I'm suggesting that your findings are based on selective presentation of information that supports predetermined conclusions. Jessica provided you with analysis that highlights potential concerns, while omitting context that explains why those practices are not just appropriate but necessary. I spent the
next hour presenting alternative interpretations of every concern Jessica had raised, demonstrating how her legal analysis ignored industry context and practical requirements. I showed how competitive bidding requirements would damage contractor relationships, how formal documentation standards would create unnecessary delays, and how legal oversight of operational decisions would make the company less competitive. But most importantly, I demonstrated how Jessica's entire review process had been designed to create justification for policy changes that would centralize operational authority under her control. Her compliance concerns weren't about protecting the company. They were about positioning herself as the solution to problems she had manufactured. By the end of the presentation, the auditors were asking different questions. Instead of focusing on my operational practices, they were examining Jessica's review methodology and the predetermined conclusions that seemed to drive her analysis. Ms. Chen, one auditor addressed Jessica, can you explain why your review focused specifically on projects with permit modifications and cost overruns rather than conducting a representative sample of all operational activities? Jessica's response was careful but revealing. Those projects represented the highest risk categories for potential compliance issues. But didn't that selection bias predetermine your findings? If you only examine complex projects with challenging circumstances, wouldn't you expect to find operational practices that appear questionable to someone unfamiliar with construction industry requirements? The purpose of the review was to identify potential vulnerabilities, not to provide general operational assessment. Then your conclusions about overall operational standards are based on analysis of exceptional circumstances rather than typical business practices. The exceptional circumstances reveal systemic issues that affect all operational activities. Robert had been listening to this exchange with growing understanding of what had actually been happening over the past months. When the auditors finished their questions, he asked Jessica and me to remain for a private family discussion. I want both of you to explain exactly what's been happening here, he began after the auditors left. Because what I'm hearing suggests that this operational review has been something other than what I understood it to be. Jessica began with a defense of her compliance concerns and risk management objectives, but her explanation sounded increasingly hollow when challenged with specific questions about methodology and predetermined conclusions. When my turn came, I presented a comprehensive analysis of Jessica's systematic campaign to eliminate my operational authority, showing how every action she had taken over the past months served the purpose of building a case for her recommended policy changes. Dad, Jessica didn't identify compliance problems. She created the appearance of compliance problems that would justify giving her control over operational decisions that have been my responsibility for 8 years. Robert studied both of us for a long moment before speaking. Jessica, I'm going to ask you directly. Was this compliance review motivated by legitimate business concerns, or was it designed to change the operational structure of this company? Dad, I've identified genuine compliance issues that need to be addressed. That's not what I asked. I asked whether this review was motivated by business concerns or personal objectives. Jessica's hesitation before answering told Robert everything he needed to know. Alex, I owe you an apology, Robert said finally. I allowed personal considerations to cloud my business judgment, and I failed to recognize what was actually happening here. What are you saying? I'm saying that effective immediately, Jessica will be returning to her previous role as a general counsel consultant, and you will resume full operational authority for all construction activities. Jessica's face went white. Dad, you're making a mistake. The compliance issues I've identified are real, and ignoring them will expose the company to significant liability. The only real issue I've identified is a systematic attempt to manipulate normal business operations for personal advantage. That's not legal compliance. That's corporate politics, and it has no place in this company. 3 days later, I received an email from Jessica, requesting a meeting to discuss her transition back to consultant status. When I arrived at her office, I found her packing legal documents and professional materials into boxes with the same efficiency she had displayed during her operational review. I wanted to apologize for how things developed, she said without looking up from her packing. I may have gotten carried away with the compliance analysis. Jessica, you didn't get carried away. You executed a comprehensive strategy to eliminate my operational authority and centralize control under your oversight. That wasn't compliance analysis. That was a corporate coup attempt. She finally looked up, her expression a mixture of regret and calculation. Alex, I really did believe there were compliance issues that needed to be addressed. You believed there were opportunities to be created, not problems to be solved. Maybe you're right. Maybe I let my MBA training and legal background convince me that theoretical problems were more important than practical results. Jessica, you let personal ambition convince you that manipulating family relationships was an acceptable business strategy. She nodded slowly, accepting the accuracy of my assessment. For what it's worth, I'm genuinely sorry that things ended this way. I'm sorry too. I'm sorry that you chose to see our family business as a game to be won rather than a legacy to be preserved. 6 months later, Chen Associates had returned to normal operations, with contractor relationships restored, operational flexibility maintained, and client satisfaction at record levels. Jessica had established her own legal consulting firm specializing in construction industry compliance, though she had discovered that creating genuine value was more difficult than manufacturing problems. Robert had learned valuable lessons about family dynamics and business judgment, recognizing that professional competence and family loyalty weren't always aligned. Most importantly, he had learned to distinguish between legitimate business concerns and sophisticated manipulation disguised as professional analysis. As for me, I had learned that success in family business required not just operational competence but political awareness and strategic thinking. Jessica's campaign had taught me that even family members could become adversaries when personal ambition outweighed shared values. But I had also learned that truth ultimately prevailed over manipulation, that authentic value creation defeated strategic positioning, and that family businesses succeeded when they prioritized competence over politics. The experience had changed all of us in fundamental ways, but it had also strengthened Chen and Associates by revealing the difference between genuine problems that required solutions and manufactured concerns that served hidden agendas. Sometimes the most important business lessons came not from external competition but from internal challenges that tested family bonds and professional principles. Jessica's compliance review had failed to achieve its intended objectives, but it had succeeded in teaching everyone involved the difference between legitimate leadership and sophisticated manipulation. The morning sun cast long shadows across the Chen Associates Construction site on southeast Burnside, where our newest commercial project was taking shape ahead of schedule and under budget.
Standing beside the foundation excavation, I watched our crew coordinate with Pacific Northwest Mechanical and Morrison Construction Services with the kind of seamless efficiency that only comes from years of trust-based relationships. The irony wasn't lost on me that this project, built using all the informal arrangements and flexible procedures Jessica had tried to eliminate, was becoming one of our most successful builds in company history. Robert joined me at the site perimeter, carrying 2 cups of coffee from the food truck that had become a fixture at our larger projects. He looked older than his 62 years, the stress of the past year having added lines around his eyes and gray to his temples. But there was also something lighter in his demeanor, as if exposing Jessica's manipulation had lifted a burden he hadn't realized he was carrying. The city inspector was here yesterday, he told me, handing over one of the coffee cups. She said our documentation and safety protocols are the best she's seen in 15 years of inspections. Apparently we're being used as an example for other contractors in the region. The recognition felt particularly satisfying given Jessica's claims about our compliance standards. While she had been manufacturing concerns about our operational procedures, we had been quietly building a reputation for excellence that regulatory officials now held up as the industry standard. Have you heard anything from Jessica recently? I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to know the answer. Robert shook his head slowly. She sent a brief email last month about landing a major consulting contract with a Seattle construction firm. Apparently they hired her to conduct a comprehensive operational review similar to what she did here. The news sent a chill down my spine. Jessica had taken her systematic approach to manufacturing compliance concerns and turned it into a marketable consulting service. Somewhere in Seattle, another operational manager was probably facing the same sophisticated dismantling of their professional reputation that I had experienced. Did she mention which firm? Cascade Development Group. They're one of the largest residential developers in the Pacific Northwest. I knew Cascade Development by reputation. They were a family-owned company similar to ours, built on relationships and operational flexibility rather than rigid procedural compliance. They were exactly the kind of target that would be vulnerable to Jessica's approach of transforming practical business arrangements into evidence of legal liability. Robert, should we warn them about what they're walking into? He considered the question for a long moment, watching our crew position steel reinforcement with practiced precision. I thought about that. But Jessica is their consultant now, and interfering with her professional engagements would make us look vindictive rather than helpful. Even though we know she's likely conducting the same kind of manipulative analysis she used against us. Even though, sometimes people have to learn these lessons for themselves, just like we did. The conversation was interrupted by Maria Rodriguez, who approached carrying a tablet and wearing the kind of expression that suggested important news. She had been promoted to operations coordinator after Jessica's departure, taking responsibility for coordinating between administrative functions and field operations with an efficiency that made the company run smoother than it had in years. Alex, I just received a call from Detective Williams with the Portland Police Bureau's white-collar crime unit, she said, her voice carrying an undertone of satisfaction. They want to schedule an interview about Jessica's consulting activities. The news was unexpected and concerning. What kind of interview? Apparently Cascade Development filed a complaint alleging that Jessica fabricated compliance violations to justify a consulting contract that restructured their entire operational hierarchy. They're claiming she manufactured evidence of financial irregularities that led to the termination of 3 senior managers. Robert and I exchanged glances, recognizing the familiar pattern of Jessica's strategic approach. She had apparently refined her methodology since leaving Chen Associates, becoming even more aggressive in her systematic dismantling of operational management structures. What specifically are they alleging? Robert asked. According to Detective Williams, Cascade is claiming that Jessica used selective financial analysis and misleading documentation to create the appearance of compliance problems that didn't actually exist. They say she systematically targeted experienced managers whose removal would consolidate operational authority under her oversight. The description was painfully familiar. Jessica had taken the lessons learned from her failed attempt to control Chen Associates and applied them more effectively at Cascade Development. But this time, her targets had apparently recognized the manipulation quickly enough to involve law enforcement. Did Detective Williams indicate what kind of evidence Cascade has provided? Email communications showing Jessica's predetermined conclusions before her analysis was complete, financial documents with misleading classifications similar to what she used here. and recorded conversations where she allegedly coached Cascade executives on how to justify manager terminations based on her findings. The recorded conversations were particularly damning. If Jessica had been caught explicitly coordinating with company executives to eliminate specific managers, it would transform her consulting activities from aggressive business practice to potential criminal conspiracy. When does Detective Williams want to conduct the interview? Tomorrow afternoon. She wants to understand the pattern of Jessica's activities here and whether they align with what happened at Cascade. I spent that evening reviewing my documentation of Jessica's systematic campaign against my position at Chen Associates, preparing to explain how her methodology could be applied to target any operational manager whose removal would benefit her consulting objectives. The pattern was sophisticated but consistent. Identify normal business practices that could be questioned under legal scrutiny, present those practices as compliance violations requiring professional oversight, and position herself as the solution to problems she had manufactured. The next afternoon, Detective Williams arrived at our offices carrying a briefcase full of documentation and wearing the kind of expression that suggested she had seen similar cases before. She was younger than I had expected, probably in her early 30s, but she spoke with the confidence of someone who understood both business operations and criminal manipulation. Mr. Chen, I want to understand exactly what happened during your sister's operational review, she began, setting up a recording device on the conference table. Cascade Development has provided evidence suggesting a pattern of fraudulent consulting practices, and we need to determine whether similar activities occurred here. I walked Detective Williams through Jessica's systematic analysis of potential vulnerabilities, her selective presentation of operational practices as compliance problems, and her policy recommendations that would have centralized authority under her oversight. I provided documentation showing how she had manufactured concerns about normal industry practices, and used those concerns to justify fundamental changes in company structure. The key pattern, I explained, is that Jessica wasn't identifying actual problems. She was creating the appearance of problems that would require her ongoing involvement to resolve. Detective Williams took extensive notes, asking detailed questions about timeline, methodology, and specific examples of how Jessica had transformed successful operational practices into evidence of potential liability. Chen, did your sister ever explicitly state that her objective was to remove you from operational responsibilities? Not directly. But every recommendation she made would have eliminated my operational authority while expanding her oversight responsibilities. The cumulative effect was clear, even if the individual steps were presented as compliance improvements. Did she ever suggest that cooperation with her recommendations would be necessary to avoid potential legal consequences? She consistently implied that failure to implement her suggestions would expose the company to regulatory scrutiny and liability claims. She used the threat of external investigation to pressure acceptance of policies that would benefit her professionally. Detective Williams showed me several documents from the Cascade Development case, and the similarities to Jessica's approach at Chen Associates were striking. She had used nearly identical language to describe compliance concerns, similar financial analysis techniques to question operational decisions, and parallel policy recommendations to centralize authority under legal department oversight. Based on what I'm seeing here, Detective Williams said, your sister appears to have developed a systematic approach to manufacturing consulting opportunities by creating the appearance of compliance problems that require ongoing professional intervention. That's exactly what happened here, except we identified the manipulation before she could fully implement her recommendations. What ultimately exposed her strategy, she made the mistake of trying to rush the timeline. When external auditors began questioning her methodology and predetermined conclusions, it became clear that she was building a case rather than conducting an objective review. Detective Williams spent another hour reviewing specific examples of Jessica's selective documentation and misleading analysis, building a comprehensive understanding of how her consulting methodology operated. When the interview concluded, she indicated that my testimony would likely be crucial for establishing the pattern of fraudulent practices that Cascade Development was alleging. 3 weeks later, Maria informed me that Jessica had been arrested on charges of consulting fraud, business interference, and conspiracy to commit financial crimes. The charges stemmed from her activities at Cascade Development, but the investigation had expanded to include her consulting work at 2 other Pacific Northwest construction companies, where similar patterns had been identified. The news generated significant attention in Portland's business community, partly because Jessica's fraudulent consulting practices had targeted successful family-owned companies that formed the backbone of the region's construction industry. Several business organizations issued statements warning about consulting fraud and encouraging companies to verify the legitimacy of compliance concerns before implementing major operational changes. Robert took the news of Jessica's arrest with the kind of grim satisfaction that comes from seeing justice served, but also with genuine sadness about what his daughter had become. "I keep thinking about how different things could have been if she had used her intelligence and legal training to actually help the company instead of trying to control it," he told me. "She had every opportunity to build something positive," I replied. "But she chose manipulation over contribution, politics over performance. The hardest part is knowing that I enabled her by not recognizing what was happening sooner. I let family loyalty cloud my business judgment, and that could have destroyed everything we've built." Robert's acknowledgement of his role in Jessica's near success was important for both of us. It demonstrated that he understood how family dynamics could be exploited to achieve business objectives, and it reinforced his commitment to making decisions based on merit rather than relationship. 6 months after Jessica's arrest, Chen Associates received recognition from the Portland Building Industry Association for operational excellence and innovative project management. The award citation specifically mentioned our ability to maintain high-performance standards while adapting to complex regulatory requirements and challenging project conditions. Standing at the podium during the awards ceremony, I reflected on how Jessica's attempted manipulation had ultimately strengthened both the company and my own professional development. Her systematic attack had forced me to articulate and defend practices that I had previously taken for granted, helping me understand why our operational approach was not just effective but superior to the rigid procedural compliance she had recommended. The experience had also taught me valuable lessons about recognizing and responding to sophisticated manipulation disguised as professional analysis. Jessica's approach could have succeeded if I hadn't learned to distinguish between legitimate business concerns and manufactured problems designed to serve hidden agendas. During my acceptance speech, I emphasized the importance of maintaining operational flexibility while ensuring genuine compliance with regulatory requirements. I spoke about the difference between procedural compliance and effective performance, and the danger of allowing theoretical concerns to override practical business judgment. The construction industry succeeds when we balance professional standards with operational efficiency, I told the audience. But we must be vigilant about distinguishing between genuine improvements and changes that serve political rather than performance objectives. The applause that followed suggested that many in the audience had encountered similar challenges in their own organizations, where ambitious individuals had used compliance concerns to advance personal agendas at the expense of operational effectiveness. After the ceremony, several other construction company owners approached me to discuss their own experiences with consultants who had manufactured problems to justify ongoing engagement. The pattern was apparently more common than I had realized, with Jessica representing just one example of professionals who exploited legitimate business concerns to create consulting opportunities. One executive told me about a consultant who had identified cultural compliance issues that required extensive diversity training and organizational restructuring. Another described an operational review that had found efficiency gaps, requiring comprehensive process re-engineering and technology upgrades. In each case, the consultant's recommendations had centralized decision-making authority, while creating ongoing revenue opportunities. These conversations reinforced my understanding that Jessica's approach represented a broader trend of manipulative consulting practices that targeted successful companies with manufactured concerns, designed to create dependency relationships. The sophistication of these approaches made them difficult to detect until significant damage had been done to operational effectiveness and organizational morale. A year after Jessica's arrest, Detective Williams contacted me to provide an update on the criminal investigation. Jessica had pleaded guilty to multiple counts of consulting fraud and had been sentenced to 3 years in prison plus restitution to the companies she had defrauded. The investigation had ultimately identified 7 companies where she had used similar manipulative techniques to manufacture consulting opportunities. "Your testimony was crucial for establishing the pattern of fraudulent practices," Detective Williams told me. "Without your documentation of her methodology at Chen Associates, we might not have been able to prove the systematic nature of her approach. I'm glad we could help protect other companies from similar manipulation. The case has generated significant attention in law enforcement circles." We're seeing more complaints about consultants who manufacture problems to justify ongoing engagement, and your case provides a template for recognizing and investigating these practices. The broader impact of exposing Jessica's fraudulent consulting methodology felt like an appropriate conclusion to an experience that had nearly destroyed my professional reputation. By documenting and publicizing the techniques she had used, we were helping other companies recognize and resist similar manipulation. Today, Chen Associates continues to operate using the relationship-based, flexibility-focused approach that Jessica had tried to eliminate. Our contractor partnerships remain strong, our client satisfaction scores are higher than ever, and our operational efficiency continues to set industry standards in the Pacific Northwest. Robert has implemented new governance procedures designed to prevent future manipulation of family business dynamics, including external review of major policy changes and independent assessment of compliance recommendations. These safeguards ensure that legitimate business concerns are addressed while preventing political agendas from undermining operational effectiveness. As for me, I've learned to appreciate the value of occasional challenges to established practices, provided those challenges are motivated by genuine improvement, rather than personal advancement. Jessica's systematic attack ultimately made me a better manager by forcing me to articulate and defend approaches that had previously been intuitive rather than strategic. The experience taught me that success in family business requires not just operational competence, but political awareness and strategic thinking. But it also reinforced my belief that authentic value creation ultimately defeats sophisticated manipulation, and that principled leadership prevails over tactical advantage. Sometimes the most important business lessons come not from external competition, but from internal challenges that test family bonds and professional principles. Jessica's fraudulent consulting campaign failed to achieve its intended objectives, but it succeeded in teaching everyone involved the difference between legitimate improvement and sophisticated exploitation. The construction industry continues to evolve, with new regulatory requirements and compliance standards creating ongoing challenges for operational managers. But the fundamental principles that guide successful construction management remain unchanged: build quality relationships, maintain operational flexibility, deliver exceptional results, and always distinguish between genuine problems that require solutions and manufactured concerns that serve hidden agendas. That distinction, perhaps more than any other lesson, represents Jessica's ultimate contribution to my professional development. By attempting to manipulate me, she taught me to recognize manipulation. By trying to undermine my authority, she forced me to strengthen my leadership. By seeking to destroy my reputation, she ultimately enhanced my credibility. In the end, Jessica's greatest failure was not recognizing that authentic success can't be manufactured through manipulation, only earned through genuine contribution. That lesson, learned at considerable cost to our family relationships, continues to guide every decision I make, as both a construction manager and a family member. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.